chair of SACU, and it's absolutely delighted to be here and delighted to welcome you all to this is SACU's very first webinar on an extremely important subject and an absolutely stellar distinguished cast of speakers for you. So my job is just to do the administration. So just to say that on the panel, before I hand over to Dr. Jenny Clegg, who is our Vice President, who will be chairing the conversation, just to say that I'm here on the sorting out the admin, together with my colleague Wang and Wang, who we three are all SACU Council members, and here just to try and do the technical work in the background. So as I say, it's a great panel and a really important subject, and I'd like to hand over to Jenny to introduce us to the panel and the conversation. Jenny.
Thanks very much, Zoe. I'll just say a few brief words just to start us off. Well, 2020, the year of the rat, was forecast to be a propitious year, but not like this. Amidst this most terrible of pandemics, US-China relations have gone into freefall, and we in the UK have not been immune from this. The decision to ban Huawei drew sharp words from the Chinese ambassador in London. Around 40 years ago, something really remarkable happened. Deng Xiaoping called on the Chinese people to learn from the West as he launched the open door policy. And over the decades, millions of Chinese students have come to study in our universities. And if only we had done more to reciprocate, maybe we would not be in the predicament that we are now facing. Nevertheless, since the 1980s, UK-China cooperation has grown roots, research links have developed, cultural exchanges have flourished, and economic and business relations have grown, culminating in the declaration of the Golden Era in 2015. But now it seems the Golden Era is over, but will the strength of the interdependencies that have developed prevail? The current situation raises many fundamental questions, and to help us tackle these issues, SACU is delighted to have a really distinguished panel, each of whom has tremendous wealth of experience and expertise to draw on in building bridges of cooperation between the UK and China, all from different fields. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Dr. Ruby Wong, cannot actually be with us. She's actually on a flight to Beijing at this moment, but she sent us a video of her talk, which we will show later. We shall probably run for just a little over an hour. Hopefully we will have time for questions. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A button to add your question. So without any more ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Professor Kerry Brown. Is Professor of Chinese Studies and Director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. He's an associate of the Asia Pacific Programme at Chatham House and an adjunct of the Australia-New Zealand School of Government. From 1998 to 2005, he worked at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and was first secretary at the British Embassy in Beijing. He's the author of over nearly 20 books on modern Chinese politics, and Kerry does a great job of promoting two-way understanding to wide audiences with frequent articles in the major international news outlets, including in China, and he's often to be seen doing interviews on the major news channels. So please, Kerry, start us off.
Great, well, thank you very much, and it's great to be with the present company, and for SACU, you do important work and have done that for many years. So I think I'm going to talk about four things briefly: sentiment, economics, values, and knowledge. So those are big things, and I'm going to do them in about 8 minutes. On sentiment, I suppose one of the things I've observed really dealing with China for nearly 30 years is British sentiments, or British kind of feelings towards China were always a little bit difficult to work out. I mean, there's not been many surveys, and the surveys that have been done have not been that extensive. And I suppose, to be honest, apart from on the issue of Hong Kong, you wouldn't say that China had much centrality in our lives until the recent sort of 6 months. So what COVID has done coronavirus has done really, I suppose, is brought more to the fore in people's daily lives this issue of China, and made them have opinions and think about China. That isn't a totally bad thing, because we do need to think about China, obviously. But it's also, I think, created a lot of, more sort of emotional responses that have, I think, proved to be very, very challenging. Politicians and all sorts of other figures now have a kind of desire, they kind of default need to have opinions on China. That again is not a bad thing, but of course there's the right opinion, the wrong opinion, the well-informed opinion, and the not well-informed opinion. And so the work of someone like SACU is really, really crucial now. I guess the second thing where the sentiment sort of leads us to is a situation where, kind of the economics, I think the battleground until now has been on the, the sort of pandemic and dealing with that rightly. But now we are moving into, the sort of economic realm. It's going to, although there may, of course, be sort of returns of, the virus, I think it is likely that the political agendas, from sort of politicians in America and Europe and elsewhere and in China are going to be about, the economics. This is where things get very, very complicated. China has, I think, just delivered, 3%, a bit over 3% growth in this quarter. The early part of the year was as disastrous as everywhere else. But I mean, the kind of, issue really is, what does the world look like where you may have a China where, the economy is doing okay, and in America where it's doing disastrously, in Europe where it's doing disastrously. I mean, those are quite amazing outcomes, really, and they kind of accelerate us towards this huge symbolic moment when China may well be the world's dominant economy, despite obviously sharing very different political values to everyone else. Another scenario of the economics may be that everyone has a terrible time. That's not good too, because everyone having a terrible time per se is not good. A final outcome could be that actually Europe and America do well, and China doesn't do so well. I mean, maybe China's next quarter will not be great growth. I mean, it's unlikely, but it's possible. So all of those have really different outcomes. All you can say at the moment is the economic situation is clearly going to determine a lot of the politics. And it's going to determine a lot of the kind of geopolitical architecture, where we're heading into. And, China's role in that is going to be pretty dynamic. It could be that pragmatically, despite strong sentiments of sort of, confusion and maybe anger towards China, there's an acceptance that, the world's second biggest economy has got to play a bigger role in the UK's economic life. And this may, totally change things. It may be that there are ways in which China is seen as kind of helping us out of the current, problems that we're facing. Or it might be that, in fact, there are deep sort of resentments, and an anger that China is blamed for sort of producing this problem. And, so we are in a position, I suppose, you can only really say on the economics and the impact of that, we are in a very fluid position. And in fact, an organization like SACU and politicians and everyone who is engaged with this issue and has been engaged with it has a big role in trying to guide this, because we could end up in very unfortunate outcomes where there's a lot of blame, a lot of resentment, a lot of misinformation, and, kind of everything basically gets thrown into disarray. So that brings me, I suppose, to the sort of values issue. There is, this sort of a necessity to acknowledge the fact that, China, which is a fifth of humanity and a fifth of the global economy, as of today, has a very different system and, different outlook on the world, a lot of that informed by history and by its, kind of recent trajectory and a whole bunch of things. And I mean, it doesn't look like that's going to change. Engagement over the last 40 years from, kind of Europe and America was often driven, I think, by a desire for economic, kind of involvement with China to see outcomes that will politically make China more similar to us. And that hasn't happened. And I think we have to sort of acknowledge that it is not likely to happen in any simple or straightforward way. And therefore, there's got to be a big, big think about, well, how do we deal with this values difference issue? We could have tolerance, and that would be great. I think that's clearly desirable. But again, we have to be pragmatic and recognize that there are significant constituencies here and in America and in Europe that do not feel particularly tolerant at the moment. And they're kind of looking at China as a threat just because it's different, even though China might not be a proselytizer and might not be trying to go into the world and change the world to adopt Sinified Marxism, Leninism. I don't think, you know, China's desire is to do that. Just the fact that it is the kind of entity it is with the kind of political system it has, and the difference that involves is a problem. So, you know, the fact that it's the way it is a problem, not that it's doing anything particularly actively, or that it's doing anything, you know, which is systemically against the sort of Western order. The fact that it is so significant and big as an economy and not like others is a problem. And so I suppose we just have to kind of find, and this is what I wrestle with all the time, how do we deal with that? On the one hand, I think as Jenny, you know, has been pointing out in some of her public statements recently, we have to acknowledge, you know, China's significant contribution to human well-being by the fact that, you know, many people in China now are living materially better lives than ever before. And we have to recognize that the world's sort of, you know, kind of material levels of well-being has increased predominantly because of the contribution of India and China. And while we can say that this is the work of the Chinese people, well, you know, kind of the fact that it has the government it has is significant, and you know, we have to work out what meaning that has in all of this. So, you know, this kind of wrestling with that positive, with the significant negatives, the issues over Hong Kong, over Xinjiang, over, you know, clearly the treatment of marginalized groups in China, these are not easy things to deal with. And it's not been at all easy to try and get some balance. So I suppose that brings me to the final thing, which is, well, okay, who is the hero in all of this? You know, when you tell this story and there's all these issues of, you know, the economy and the sentiments and the dilemmas, there's got to be a kind of, you know, some heroic arrival. And I suppose that's really got to be a mission by all of us, I think, to just ensure that the knowledge levels throughout, you know, the UK in particular, because that's what we're talking about, but everywhere improve about China. We live in a weird asymmetry where, you know, knowledge levels mostly by Chinese towards Europe and America are better than those the other way. And I think that kind of is a real important battle, because whatever happens, my conclusion, you know, my concluding words would be, whatever happens, I cannot see in the current very complicated situation how we are going to have any kind of desirable outcome when we are not well informed and not knowledgeable. We must do something about that. It doesn't matter that we like or dislike the China we're dealing with, but if we don't really understand and know it, then how can we have any, you know, kind of admissible idea or attitude at all? So that will be my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Kerry. Very wide angle and highlighting the key issues so clearly and accessibly, and I'm sure leading to more searching questions. So thank you very much. Our next speaker first visited China in 1965 and has made over 70 visits as a businessman at the Guangzhou trade fairs, negotiating with China's trade corporations. As an arbiter in 12 arbitrations appointed by non-Chinese parties, and he's also worked on sporting and legal visits. Graham Perry is visiting professor of dispute resolution at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. He was at the beginning of SACU, SACU's foundation, and as a student set up a branch in Cambridge right at the beginning, and later became a vice chairman of SACU in the 1970s and 1980s. So Graham Perry, over to you.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for inviting me. Zoe too, pleased to be here, resuming links with SACU after such a long period of time. I'll resist the temptation to do a tour of history and jump straight into the issues, Jenny, that you've asked me to address, which is the impact of a more difficult relationship between the UK and China, and then I'll have some observations about the way forward. But in my area of activity, which over the last 20 years has been dispute resolution, arbitration, the law, I'm satisfied that there will be little consequence to the deteriorating relations between East and West. Principal focus of work in China is SACU, which is a very experienced international arbitration center, which has worked closely with foreign arbitrators. I've sat on panels where there have been 3 non-Chinese arbitrators, or 2 and 1, and the issues have been quite acute, but where the resolution, to my experience, in all the arbitrations I've been involved in, has been very fair to both parties. In most cases, I have to say the foreign party has won. I believe SACU is impartial. As I said, foreign companies win regularly, foreign arbitrators are permitted, and I believe the same will apply to the local arbitration chambers. The issues at the high political level of Trump and the freezing of relations with China over recent months, I don't think will have an immediate impact upon my area of work, because there is a very long gestation period between the decision to include an arbitration clause in a contract and then having the dispute and then having the dispute resolution. The process is quite a long one. But it does lead me to wanting to consider the present situation vis-a-vis China and the deteriorating relations, because we can't go far without bearing in mind either the issue which has been thrust in front of us in recent months of Taiwan, or Hong Kong, or China, India, or the Uyghurs, or South China Sea, or human rights. And we have to ask ourselves, why has this happened, and where is it leading to, and what consequences will it have? I'm tempted to remind us all of something that Tony Blair said about China. He urged people to understand China from China's perspective. And that's a very difficult thing for a lot of people to do. And the reason why it's difficult for a lot of people to do is because Britain and China arrive at 2020 from 2 very different routes. Britain, those of us raised in this Western democracy, have experienced Magna Carta, habeas corpus, revolt against the king, the supremacy of parliament, the Great Reform Bill, one man, one vote, the Westminster system of government, which is replicated in other Western countries. And that's become the norm, and we think that is the norm. And then when we look at China, we see a very, very different historical experience. We see one of dynasties, very authoritarian, very led from the center. We then look at the century of humiliation and the Opium Wars, and the ways in which the British badly treated China. We then have the rise of China out of the civil war between the communists and the Kuomintang, and the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. So the 2 countries arrive at the present with very, very different journeys. And we are not very good at understanding China's path to the present. We understand our own, but we're not very good at looking at things from the other side. Much of this, of course, depends on the outcome of the November election. Trump has decided to make China a focus of discontent in the hope that he can make good the difference in the deficit that he has in the opinion polls. And we have to wait and see the outcome of the American election and see what then happens. If it's Biden, will there be a more conciliatory set of policies? If it's Trump, will it be more controversial? But we have to accept that for the present, something is happening which the Chinese have always foreseen, that the Americans would find it very difficult to accept the rise of China. And there's another aspect to it which people often overlook. China spent a lot of time examining the failure of the Soviet Union. The research institutes pored over every aspect of Soviet life so that the Chinese could understand what it was about the experience of the Soviet Union that led to its failure. Why? Because they wanted to ensure that China didn't go the same route. And they came to 2 conclusions, which are in some ways contradictory. On the one sense, one respect, they recognize the greater need than ever before for greater decentralization of business initiative. Very different from the Soviet model of heavy centralization. Not only was it a matter of separating out decision-making, but also breaking up the monopolies of the state and the granting coming into being of many independent economic units, albeit in some kind of relationship with the state, but also infused with their own element of creativity. And China has benefited enormously and entered the WTO in 2001. And if you read Trump and you read the British, you will see that many somehow assume that if China entered into WTO and enjoyed prosperity, that their political system would change in a way very, very different to the one that they had hitherto enjoyed. That somehow the granting of greater economic initiative and economic rights would lead to more political rights, and somehow the downgrading of the Communist Party. And this was the second aspect of the Chinese study of the Soviet Union, was a greater centralization of power within China. And the hopes and aspirations of Western capitalists, Western liberals, Western humanists, that hope that somehow China would emerge out of this tight dictatorial attitude towards government, towards something that was more veering towards the Western model, was never going to happen. And there's a couple of reasons for it. One is that the Chinese over the last 40 years, to coin a phrase invented by Harold Macmillan, have never had it so good. They've had a most wonderful surge of prosperity. And should they concede that and begin to assume into their political system elements of a Western model, which is at variance with the one that they've hitherto observed. So I think the West has fundamentally misunderstood the dynamic of development. And here I echo the words of Kerry. There's got to be a much greater ability, much greater attempt to understand China's on China's terms. China isn't the country that the Soviet Union was. There is no Comintern. China doesn't support a whole host of communist parties in a lot of vulnerable states. China wants prosperity for the Chinese because prosperity and stability go together. And we have to understand how best we can merge in with the Chinese plans and ambitions to ensure that what is good for us is also good for China, instead of which we are at the moment in the grip of this frenzied Cold War, which we have to hope will change after the November election, even if it's replaced by something more difficult, will still allow the opportunity for greater exchanges between the two. I'm sorry, I think my phone has gone off. You can probably hear it. There we are, it stopped. Sorry, I just wanted to end by bringing it together and saying there is hope, there is optimism, and there is expectation, but not if we insist that the Chinese follow our way of doing things. That is the mistake that the West is making, even the British government is making, even the British Labour Party is making. They have to view China and China's perspective from China's historical experience and not from our wish to impose our experience on China. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you so much for that, Graham, and for setting out the differences in our histories and our historical development, and how that's brought us to the situation that we are now, which is a very good entry for our next speaker, Michael Wood. Michael is best known for his wonderful TV programs on Chinese history. He's been visiting and filming in China since the 1980s, and his films have included the much acclaimed 6-part Story of China, and more recently a series of films on Deng Xiaoping's Opening Up and Reform. He's currently Professor of Public History at the University of Manchester, and he's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, Royal Society of Arts, and the Society of Antiquaries. He's recently received the British Academy President's Medal for Services to History and Outreach, and his new book, The Story of China, is due to be launched very shortly, I believe. We're very honoured in SACU that Michael has agreed to be our president, following in the footsteps of Joseph Needham and Asa Briggs. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Jenny. It's lovely to be with you all, and it's a great honour to be involved with SACU. Undeserved honour, I might say. I'm not a sinologist, just somebody who has long been fascinated by China and loved China. Our theme today is, I'll be brief because we mustn't run out of time here. Our theme today is the positive values of cooperation in difficult times. And I think that especially having spent a lot of time in the last 7 years in China, it couldn't be more important. That issue couldn't be more important. Number one, and obviously for the peace of the world. Number two, obviously, as Kerry and Graham have both said, for the well-being of the world, the economic well-being of all of us. And number three, I would also add, because of the biggest crisis that the world faces, in which the next 9-10 years will be absolutely crucial, which is climate and environment. The attempt to turn back the climate disaster that we all face will be impossible without China. And for that reason alone, cooperation is absolutely must override many of the other issues that are going on at the moment in terms of politics. And I think we have to take, it was a great moment when President Xi announced that China was going to follow the Paris Climate Accords in 2014. And they're serious, I believe, about creating an environmental civilization. They're doing things about it. And for those reasons, cooperation is essential. We mustn't lose sight of the big picture. And then turning to what Kerry said, the focus, therefore, for us should be on knowledge. Our knowledge levels must improve. Part of this cooperation must be to help create a more informed and knowledgeable public in the West. These are really crucial. And to explain each other, I think there's a great merit in explaining to each other as best we can, given the difficulties of dealing with China in terms of media. I'll say something briefly about that. There's a really great merit. There's a hunger to know in China. The people of China are very, very anxious to explain themselves to the world, to be represented in a fairer way. And that struck me very strongly over the last few years. We've made a dozen films in that time, as you've heard, 6 films on the story of China, 5 films on Deng Xiaoping's opening up 40 years ago, in which we interviewed many eyewitnesses and participants. And then very recently, this year, a film about Du Fu, and China's greatest poet. And in all these cases, what's been interesting is not only the reaction from Western viewers saying, I wish I'd known more. I had no idea that it was like this. I didn't realize, but from Chinese audiences who've responded directly by email, by letters, by a huge amount of online stuff, by journalism, by interviews. One of these films, we got 100 million hits for the promo in 24 hours on 10 cents. So there is a thirst to know, and there is a thirst for fair representation. So I think these are all things we can build on, and that's why we filmmakers and book writers do what we do. We want to be the intermediaries between the experts, my fellow panelists, and the general public out there. Now, finally, before I finish, I would say actually making films in China it's a real pleasure. It's not as difficult as people think. The biggest problem often is to try and confine your film crew to a short lunch, which is unheard of in Britain when you're filming, but in China, 12 o'clock means 12 o'clock. But it's a real pleasure. There's surprisingly little red tape once you've got your permissions through. The problems come afterwards if you're trying to do a real co-production with the Chinese, because, as you'd gather from Graham, when it comes to doing co-productions with the Chinese, with the best will in the world, they simply cannot stop interfering. They cannot trust you to give up control. And that can make certain kinds of filmmaking difficult. The films that we did for the BBC, Story of China, were unmediated and seen in China. The film we did on Dufu was a co-production with CCTV, but a slightly different version was put out in China. The CCTV seemed to feel that 8th century history and an 8th century poet was uncontroversial. Well, that turned out not to be the case when we got all the feedback. More difficult was doing a series of films on Deng Xiaoping's Open Up with a Chinese production company, good as they were and sensitive as they were to the difficulties that dealing with 1978 to 1980 involved. Of course, there's no chance of you dealing with the events of 1989 yet in China, even though some quite eminent interviewees were prepared to talk about it, but it's not something you can put on Chinese TV. So that's just to give you a very brief idea of what it's like to make films there, the importance of making films there. There is a need to, you've got to be careful because the Chinese are willing to throw money. The Chinese state, the state broadcasters are willing to throw money at anybody who will make a pro-Chinese film. We've been approached with large sums of money to do films like History of the Communist Party, which were literally impossible to make. So you've got to be careful as filmmakers, but the urgent need is to explain ourselves to each other. And I do think it's a valuable task. There are issues with it. It doesn't always work. But for me, positive cooperation is the essential value at our time. Okay? I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Michael, for that and for sharing your experiences. Much to build on indeed. Now we are going to go to the video which was made by Dr. Ruby Wang. And before we actually start that, I just want to encourage people to put your questions in the Q&A so that we can have a little bit of discussion with the panel afterwards. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dr. Ruby Wang, and I'm very excited today to have been invited to speak on this SACU public event on the topic of UK-China relations, finding the way forward for cooperation in difficult times. Thank you to SACU Chair Zoe Reid and Vice President Jenny Clegg for inviting me to speak alongside a distinguished panel, including Mr. Graham Perry, Professor Kerry Brown, and Professor Michael Wood. Many apologies that I can't be there in person today, as around the time that the panel event will be going ahead, I'll actually be on the plane traveling from London to China. So I thought I would introduce my background and then speak a little on this topic. And I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel and hearing all of their profound insights as well. So first of all, on my background, I'm a medical doctor in the NHS in the UK. I was born in China in Hangzhou, and I moved to the UK when I was 7 years old. And since then, I've grown up across the two countries and across the two cultures of UK and China. I finished medical school at the University of Cambridge and University College London, and went on to practice medicine in London and in Oxford in the NHS hospitals. I've also gained experience studying at Tsinghua University in China, and also experience working in health technology and health policy in China. As I fly from the UK to China on the 1st of September, I'm very excited to be starting a role at the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office at the British Embassy in Beijing to lead their China health programme. And this is really where I want to begin. I'm flying to China, where I'll be mandated to stay for 2 weeks in a hotel in quarantine upon arrival to China mainland. However, if I was flying from China to the UK, the reverse way round, there would be no quarantine if I arrived in the UK right now. And so I want to pose that question to all of you. Why are there such stark differences in terms of policy and in terms of regulations in coronavirus. Why is it so different between the UK and China, and indeed between other countries around the world? As this global pandemic affects all of us across all nations, this is a unique instance where health and medicine have intersected with policy, with politics, with economics, with society, and with cultural norms. And so in the context of suggested deteriorating relations and changing attitudes across international borders, I really do want to highlight that collaboration and learning and cooperation are truly key, not only for management of COVID-19, but also for healthcare systems and healthcare policy and members of the public really around the world that might be affected. And therefore, I would like to continue on to list 4 to 5 main areas where I believe that UK-China mutual development and benefits for collaboration can be identified. So first of all, to begin with, I'd like to talk about China. We've seen the virus begin in China back in January, and then as it moved across the world, reach the shores of the UK around March time, properly. We saw from the UK how China took decisive actions to implement strict quarantines and travel bans within the city of Wuhan, within the province surrounding Wuhan, and travel bans that affected international travel. And so China banned all international passengers from entering China from March 20th onwards, and it was only since July to August time that China has allowed international visas to be passed and for foreigners to slowly enter China. And so such strict measures were very interesting when viewed from the Western perspective. Here in the UK, whilst we saw that strict measures were potentially effective in controlling numbers of COVID infection and indeed numbers of COVID mortality, we were still aware that over here in England, we may not be able to implement such strict measures because social measures are really dependent upon the capacity of the people to follow government and to follow rules and regulations. And I think it was both an unwillingness, I guess, of the people to follow rules and regulations, but also an unwillingness on the part of government to implement such strict strategies that they knew would not be viewed so positively by the people here. And so that's really an interesting example of how cultural norms and societal norms really impact policy making and decision making in the context of COVID-19. A second point that I would like to make is that China is really a massive scale compared to the UK. And so masses of the population can be infected quickly. And yet again, masses of the population can go through treatment processes more quickly than in the UK. And so as clinical trials are implemented, as medications are tested, and as movement of people expanded, we could really learn from those changes and implementations here in the UK and see what worked and what did not work in hospitals. For example, the level of preparedness in China. The Chinese government chose an interesting strategy to build up temporary hospitals in the city of Wuhan and surrounding areas, which were touted as 10-day hospitals. So huge, thousands of bed temporary locations were built up within 10 days in China. And we actually followed in those footsteps here in the UK, which I think was especially promoted since what we saw in Italy, which was that there was a lack of hospital beds, there were lots of patients in corridors not being able to be treated, a lack of capacity of the healthcare system to cope, which really accelerated the numbers of mortality. And so in the UK, the government decided to set up Nightingale hospitals in London, in Manchester, in Birmingham, and so on. Also, within less than 2 weeks' time, to rapidly increase the capacity of the healthcare system to deal with what could potentially be a huge influx of cases, which would put pressure on the National Health Services. And indeed, we saw that whilst the Nightingale hospitals were not really used, I think at most the London Excel Centre, the London site of the Nightingale Hospital, was at its peak used about 43 beds in total of thousands of temporary beds that were set up. Still, the amount of training that was implemented, the amount of resources that were funneled into these streams was truly incredible, and really showed that not only could the UK follow a lesson from China in what could potentially be effective, the fact that the Nightingale hospitals weren't really needed was really a positive effect of the capacity of the UK healthcare services to deal with COVID numbers. A third point that I would like to make is the role of technology. This has so many various streams that we could talk about. In China, for example, contact tracing using mobile applications, using GPS data has been used as a very, very useful tool to track the spread of the virus. Temperature checking, also using newer forms of technology such as temperature cameras have been used in China, and antigen testing for current COVID infection have been rapidly developed across China, across South Korea and other nations, and has been slowly implemented in the UK. I think at first when we implemented free NHS antigen testing, the turnaround for that was 48 to 72 hours. But in the past months of late July to August time in the UK, we've also been developing faster speeds of testing. And so now, if you were to get tested, the turnaround is about 24 hours. So as technology and research improves, so does our capacity for managing the spread of the virus. Another sector where I think health technology has been really key is the realm of online consultations. As social distancing quarantine has mandated, doctors are simply unable to get to the patients that need to see them. And so physical face-to-face consultations have been moved online into virtual and teleconsultations. In China, this was already happening before the onset of COVID. The population was already tech-savvy. China had already leapfrogged in many cases in terms of technology. Much of the population uses WeChat and mobile applications every day and are very familiar with using health technology platforms. However, here in the UK, in the NHS, things have been much slower. So in an environment where traditionally we still use cord telephones and bleepers and fax machines and Microsoft XP, we've seen a rapid push for technological ways of providing medical care. For example, GPs have been providing virtual consultations via Skype, via Microsoft Teams and other licensed platforms. And in the time where push comes to shove, really, and there's been no other choice, I do believe that the rapid pace at which clinicians have been trained to use these new online platforms has allowed the NHS to move forward on the technological front, and this can be viewed as a positive way forward for the future, really, where we can maybe provide better and more accessible care to more of the population. A final point that I would like to highlight in terms of UK-China collaboration in the context of COVID-19 is really scientific collaboration. We've seen across the world, not only the UK and China, but all of the nations, that collaboration has been key in terms of clinical trials, in terms of knowledge sharing, whether that's for potential medications that might be effective, potential vaccine development. And this, again, is where there is no other way, because it's a race against time to control the virus. And in the context where we don't know enough information, for example, we don't know what medicines work There's been hype about anti-malarials, anti-HIV drugs, and more recently, potential effectiveness of steroid medications. Vaccine development is still an area where we are still under development because we don't know how long immunity for COVID-19 lasts, even if you have been positively infected in the past. And we don't know how asymptomatic transmission really works. So when we don't know enough information in the medical context, the only way forward is to pool what we do know, as well as pool capacity of all the experts together. And that's really global collaboration at its best. And so in light of these 4 points, really, my question is, what of the future? Well, I believe that even more collaboration and mutual learning is required. And this is where the UK and China may be 2 top players in this field. The UK's national health system is one of the most well-respected and top-ranked healthcare systems in the world, providing free, quality, and cost-effective care that's available to everyone, regardless of their background. And so using what the UK is strong in, which is primary care services, social care services, community care services, and public health, we can utilise training and education and sharing of resources in order to educate both clinicians and the general public in order to prevent future pandemics from happening. And the UK can really teach China in these areas where it's the most strong. At the same time, the UK can improve on and learn from China's technology and healthcare intersection. Medicine is truly becoming digital, and a push is really required to make these changes. So overall, to conclude, I do believe that COVID has broken down barriers across countries for science, for healthcare, and for medicine, and created a short-term openness across borders because of need and must, at least in the scientific community. But let's all ensure that this openness is indeed long-term and sustained and allows us to continue to collaborate across borders. And so I think that's it from me for now, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak today.
That was really great and really informative from Ruby. I realised that I didn't introduce her properly at the beginning. I apologise for that. And I should have said that, as she made clear, she's a UK medical doctor working on the NHS front line, but she's also the incoming China head of programme delivery for health and life sciences at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office at the British Embassy in Beijing, which is why she's flying to Beijing at this moment. And she has experience on both the British and the Chinese side, working in various capacities with the British Medical Council and Royal Society of Medicine, and has also acted as a medical advisor for Ali Health at Alibaba. So again, I apologise for that. Now we have some questions that have come in. I will just choose a few, and then the panel can decide which ones they want to respond to. So the first question that we have is from Peter Manning, OBE. And he says, what types of helpful UK-China civic engagements are going to be seen to be acceptable when the list of bad things that the Chinese Communist Party is doing is real? Any engagement with China involves working with organizations led by the Chinese Communist Party to one degree or another. So UK China hawks can easily shoot engagement initiatives down, ? I'll also put in another question here, which came to us in advance from Walter Fung. And he puts the question around perhaps in a different way. He says, anti-China Cold War attitudes have really been with us, especially since 1949, intensifying of late. These attitudes are very deep-seated, probably pre-1900 and before. How can we influence the media, the BBC and the press? How do we make people such as senior Tories understand? And what are the long-term objectives? And I'll just take one more. As all the speakers have correctly highlighted, the way forward is through positive cooperation. How do we achieve this mutually beneficial relationship in practice rather than submitting to business merely on Chinese terms? So I don't know which one of you three want to kick off here. I can see Graham's hand going up. And,
I'm just happy to get it going. I'm sure that the views of Michael and Kerry are just as valid as mine, so I'm not claiming any priority for them. We are in the midst of a very heavy Cold War atmosphere, the like of which our generation hasn't seen, because its predecessor was in the 50s under the influence of John Forster Dulles. Never has there been such an anti-China feel in public sentiment and public comment. It's led by governments, not by businessmen, and this is one distinction I would make. Politicians have their own agendas, but businessmen have a separate agenda, and businessmen will vote for their feet, whether it's HSB, whether it's AstraZeneca, whether it's other business people who will see the opportunities and the benefits of closer cooperation with China. Just at the time that the Henry Jackson Society and the right wing of the Conservative Party and even elements of the Labour Party will insist on decoupling from China. Decoupling does not work. China is not going to go away. China has proven itself in battle, it's proven itself in development. If there are things about China that we don't like, we don't engage in megaphone diplomacy.
Okay.
We could take a leaf out
Only
of the
5
book.
minutes for questions.
We could take a leaf out of the book of Edward Heath, who always said if he had criticisms to make of the Chinese, he would do it in private meetings and not necessarily on public platforms. But at the moment, the West is under the leadership of a maniac. Trump is pursuing a policy against China which has everything to do with his own political future and not to do with the importance of establishing closer links with China. As I said before, China does not seek world domination. China does not seek, China has no military, no soldiers, no navy outside of China, and yet is surrounded by 52 American bases, and yet it's China who gets the bad publicity. So I'm saying that there isn't a nice way to deal with this. We are in a Cold War, and those of us who think the government's on the wrong side have got to confront government. Confronting government doesn't mean being rude to them, but it does mean taking every opportunity to get in front of every relevant audience and putting points of view that we believe to be the right ones, and not be overwhelmed by the right-wing anti-communist rhetoric that has its origins in John Forster Dulles in America in the 1950s. I'm sorry to be so firm about it, Jenny, but you know, beating around and pretending we can discuss this academically and pleasantly, the fact of the matter is we're being led in the wrong direction. Eventually the world will realize, and this is my last point, because China is not going away. China is not going to go the same way as the Soviet Union. We don't have to be in love with China. I'm English, I love England, I love the English way of life. I don't want to go and live in China. I'd struggle to live in China because it's not the natural harmony of my upbringing and my life, and I'm not afraid to say that. There are things about China that are not quite right for me, but that doesn't prevent me from feeling that we benefit in Britain and the world benefits if we have closer links with China And that's what SACU has always been about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Graham.
Yes,
Kerry,
I
no
can.
doubt.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm not really part. I mean, my institute, the Lao China Institute at King's, it's non-partisan. So I mean, it's really sort of more about you know, kind of trying to work a framework of understanding this. I mean, I don't think, I slightly disagree because I don't think it's a Cold War. The USSR had a very specific space and was a sort of proselytizer in some ways. And the interesting thing about China is that it's actually integrated in some areas, you know, in the internet and all sorts of other areas, or not the internet, but, you know, finance and supply chains and technology. You know, the interesting thing is that it's kind of integrated into a sort of global system. And that's something that COVID-19 has exposed, I suppose. It's also a good stakeholder in climate change, as I think someone earlier said. And as Ruby Wang's sort of presentation made clear, you know, in some ways, it's now technology leader. So this is a very different kind of situation than the Cold War. It's not neat. There aren't neat boundaries. It's not an easy kind of situation to deal with. And I suppose in mitigation, you've got to say that for publics in Europe and America, it is a big thing to deal with, you know, the arrival of this huge new partner that is so different. And they've been ill prepared for it. I'm not saying that's anyone's fault, but, you know, this is a big thing to take on board. I suspect the answer to this sort of set of questions is going to be led by what happens in the economy, because there are cooperations and collaborations that one chooses, and there are cooperations and collaborations that one has to do because of necessity. So we don't know what a world looks like where potentially China is economically incredibly important to the solution of our economic problems, specifically for the UK. You know, the anomaly is that the UK at the moment has a suboptimal economic relationship with China. China is not a big investor here. It's not a huge trading partner. It's got bigger, but it's not as big as Europe or America. And it seems to me, just specifically about the UK, that if we are going to be in a situation of low or negative growth and maybe mass unemployment, the political dynamics totally changes. And I don't really understand then how politicians would be able to say, despite those massive challenges, we don't deal on a point of principle with the world's second biggest economy. So this isn't an issue really about ideology. It's an issue about, well, I mean, that would be an issue about ideology, but to me, it's an issue about how politically palatable is that going to be? I mean, are you really going to have politicians either of the left or the right or the center being able to tell the public, well, we are going to stick to what we said last year, that China is a big, big problem and we're never going to deal with it, despite the fact that there may be very, very valid areas in which it will absolutely offer, you know, kind of help in economic growth and in kind of, you know, sort of job creation. And that seems to me to be a quandary that the current, you know, sort of political atmosphere has created. Finally, the issue of reciprocity is really important. The perception, which may be wrong, is that China does asymmetrical deals. And that's really an issue because with WTO, and Graham will know better about this than any of us, but, you know, the perception is that it has got a good deal, although the reality probably is totally different. The perception is that, you know, it always comes out as the winner. You know, China goes for win-win because it wins twice, right? I mean, you know, and this sort of is an issue because that has got to be addressed. If the perception's wrong, China needs to communicate that much better. If the perception's right, the era of asymmetrical deals, I think, has come to an end. But basically because China is in a stronger position now in many areas. So it's got to be better at doing deals where people at least come away thinking that they are also winning. And that has not been the case. For the UK, again, reciprocity is important. And finally, you know, for reciprocity, we've got to also have the knowledge to be able to do these deals with China. And at the moment, of course, we are handicapped by that lack of knowledge. Thanks.
Thank you, Kerry. Michael, I don't know whether you've got any observations that you want to
only a supplementary to that, Jenny, which is really Kerry's thing. But the question about anti-Chinese feeling. You know, it's very interesting from the point of view of filmmakers and people who are trying to do this sort of thing in the public media. You know. And we detect that everywhere. There's a coldness towards China. I was very struck by going to America to talk about the story of China films there. And the same New York Times critic who'd gone overboard about the story of India said of the story of China that, well, it was great if you liked it, but it's too friendly to China. And that was a TV critic, you know. And so it was really to throw it back to Kerry, who I know is writing a book on the outside views of China. There was a point when people thought China was the greatest civilization in the world, wasn't there, Kerry? And at what point did that change? Was it under Mao or was it earlier?
I mean, that's a great question, but I think what's always been disorientating in Western audiences is this question of what do Chinese believe? And if you think now, you know, it's really a sort of huge question, isn't it? You know, they have a communist system, but they're great capitalists. So I suppose the next decade is going to see this amazing situation where it is likely the world's greatest practitioner of capitalism is going to be a communist country. That is one hell of a punchline, right? That's going to be the ultimate punchline. You know, the end of history is this situation. So, and I don't really know where you do the script to that. Maybe you can help us. You know, you can film this and help us.
Graham, have you got a comment on that?
Well, just this point about capitalism and communism. It's an interesting one, and Kerry's just touched on it. But what many people think was that Deng Xiaoping recognized the problems facing China back in 1979 and realized, he came out with that wonderful phrase, I don't mind whether it's a white cat or a black cat, so long as it catches the mouse. I don't mind whether it's capitalism or socialism, so long as it brings prosperity to the Chinese people. And for those of us who lived through the Cultural Revolution and remember the Great Leap Forward and everything, then the intensely political era that accompanied that period, it was in quite a remarkable change around, led by the Communist Party, which Kerry has properly pointed to. So it's a question of prosperity and development. But the Chinese, I don't think, will likely surrender their commitment to Marx and Lenin because they do believe the success that they've achieved isn't simply because they are Chinese, but also because they've been followers of that ideology, although, as we know the phrase, with Chinese characteristics. And you know, Mahbubani, Professor Mahbubani, which some of you may know in his recent book, referred to an interesting statistic, which I always quote when I'm talking to people who believe that China is groaning under an unfair dictatorship. I think it's 2018 or 2019. The figure is that 134 million Chinese toured abroad and 134 million came home. That's a very interesting statistic.
Can I ask a question to Jenny and Graham? Because this is you're the only people I can really ask this to in the whole of the UK. You remember China's image in the Cultural Revolution, right? I mean, is it at all similar now? Do you feel there's similarities between China in the 1960s and its image in Britain and what you're seeing now, or is it totally different? You know, that kind of antagonism and sort of mutual sort of aggression. Do you think that's what we're seeing? Is it similar or totally different?
I've done a bit of talking, so I'm happy to speak. But Jenny, do you want to go in first on that?
Oh dear, that's a long time ago, Kerry. It's really, I've got to dig deep here. And I was very young then, but I did feel that quite a lot of the time, it's very difficult to even say that you were interested in China.
Right.
And so I don't think things have got quite that bad, but I do see that sometimes in some of the newspapers like the Sunday, whatever it is, you know, they actually name people as, you know, collaborate or virtually collaborated as spies for the Chinese Communist Party. And my heart bleeds for them, because if they're young people, I think, what is this going to do to their careers? So there is a certain whiff of McCarthyism, and probably it's a little bit stronger in the United States than it is here. We're having a fascinating discussion here, but I am keeping my eye on the time. And we've had quite a lot of questions that have come in. Some of them are comments more than questions. I think that a couple of people have raised the question of the joint declaration, but I really wanted to sort of wind up and the question that's been running through my mind throughout everybody's talk, because everybody really has emphasized the importance of understanding China, knowing more about China, being able to see through the disinformation, being able to look from the Chinese perspective. You know, Ruby Wong talks about mutual learning. How do we go about this? You know, how do we actually, you know, it feels a bit like, you know, Sisyphus trying to push the stone up the hill and it keeps rolling back. And one question that we have from one of our council members, Barnaby Powell, he says, let me just find it here. How can we meet the need for more Mandarin Chinese speakers? Which I think puts it in a nutshell. So I'll have just a couple of minutes, perhaps from all of you, if you want to take up any of those points and to wind up with your last thoughts. So over to you, Kerry.
Yeah, I mean, there's a report in the Economist this week saying that the number of people at school studying Mandarin is going down in the UK because it's regarded as being too difficult. I think the solution, in a kind of briefly, is the one that Tim Clissold, some of you know, has been proposing, of an A-level in Chinese civilization, because I think we have to be pragmatic and accept it's going to be a tough thing for British people to learn Chinese, right? I think, it's going to be, that's not going to be easy for many, many people. But having some knowledge about the culture, the history of China, I think is important now. It's really important. And it seemed very simple to have an A-level proposed for the, that kind of area. It's not been possible for a number of reasons, but I think that is something we should urgently lobby for even more. As I say, Tim Clissold has been in charge of that, but it's an ongoing thing. We have never really got very far with the Department for Education, but I think we really should revisit it, because that kind of thing, because it will be done predominantly in English, is much more pragmatic, and I think would be very beneficial. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kerry. Graham?
Well, I mean, this has been a very good discussion. As a listener, listening to Kerry, listening to Michael, listening to Ruby has been really very, very interesting. And it shows you that what SACU wants to do, which is to have exchanges with China, can displace the present frenetic anti-China atmosphere that permeates our political hierarchy. And that's the problem that we have. People in the Tory party, people in the Labour Party, and I suspect people in the Liberal Democratic Party have written off China. They've succumbed to the view that China is a tyrant, whether it's the Uyghurs, whether it's Tibet, whether they reel off these list of negatives and make it very difficult for us to do what Kerry and Michael, I'm sure, would like us to do, which is to press forward with more initiatives. We have to somehow break the stranglehold of the anti-China feeling and mentality. And to do that, it needs greater people than the three of us and yourself, Jenny. People in the public eye have got to stand up and be counted and say, we've got it wrong about China. We've got to change our thinking. It doesn't mean that we succumb, but it means that we recognize that the path that the Chinese have taken is different for valid reasons from the path we have taken. There's an element of cultural imperialism about us saying, do it our way.
Okay.
That's my point.
Thanks.
And I think we have to divest ourselves. It's like a throwback to gunboat diplomacy. We know best. Well, did we know best in the 19th century? Do we know best now? Now, I remember discussing these things when Kerry was at the embassy. And they were interesting discussions in those days, Kerry. Even more interesting now. But the one permanent thing is, China is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And we better find a way to live with it instead of trying to knock it on the nose every time it appears above the parapet.
Right. Thanks so much, Graham. Michael?
Yeah, we keep coming back to the issue about that we need our culture to understand China better. And if you want to understand China better, you must know about something about the history and the culture. I think that's the central thing. So I think Tim Clissold's idea of the A-level in Chinese civilization is a really great idea. And the thing is, it would be a wonderful subject to do. You can't find a history or a culture that is more dramatic, more creative, more humane, I would say, you know, and the interaction of literature and science with the story of history is so much all the way through, you know, so you get everything with history of Chinese civilization. So I would, of course, I'm biased, you know, but I would push that very, very strongly, I think, you know, and the humaneness of the culture. I would say more than anything else. The day one when we did Story of China, I said to the team, look, the history we hope will take care of itself, but the number one thing I want to come out of this after 20 years, 30 years traveling in China is the character of the people, affable, sociable, you know, love their history. And I think, you know, that's one of those things to break as well. I've never been stopped so many times on the tube going to work when those films went out by people saying, I had no idea China was like that. And that's what we're striving for, isn't it? You know, not talking abstractly, but talking about the people and their culture that they love, and how great it is for you to know more about it, how we all need to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to all of our distinguished panelists. It's been a really interesting discussion. Lots of questions have been raised, great challenges ahead of us. I think this has been an important event, and I, for one, will be watching it again because there's so much that has been said, so much to absorb, and we will be sharing it on our YouTube channel. So please, if you've enjoyed this, please do share it as well, the viewers out there. I think it's at a time like this when we really need to have the voices of people like Kerry and Graham and Michael and Ruby, voices of experience, weight and wisdom. We need these to be heard, both by the wider public and amongst the powers that be. And this is the challenge before us. I do think that despite a lot of negativity, there is, for some people, a growing appetite in Britain for understanding China. And I'm sure that all our panelists will be continuing to make valuable contributions here. And I wish them every success in their continuing efforts. And no doubt SACU will be coming back to all of you for your advice and guidance and contributions and enthusiasm. So thank you so much from all of us.
Thanks a lot.
Okay then,
Bye.
we'll close the session now. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
There we go.